They don't make video game developers like EA anymore, and thankfully so, because there's only room for one terrible video game company, although sometimes the video game industry is overrun with misguided decisions and a conga line of lemmings leading the industry off a cliff and into the news headlines for terrible, terrible reasons, but, you know, at least EA aren't doing more to ruin their reputation, although not for a lack of trying.
You have to hand it to EA, they sure do have a lot of money. I wouldn't quite say that they know how to use it, but they know that in order to make money, it does help to latch onto existing projects like a leech and rinse them from all their worth, despite whatever dried husk they leave behind. EA have attached themselves to some really incredible video games at some stage in their history, but the more they become associated with disastrous projects, the more their reputation is swayed by their blunt, tone-deaf actions and an inability to learn from their more egregious mistakes. Though, I say mistakes, but if you told me that some of these games are the way they are as some kind of twisted self-sabotage, I might just believe you. It's just the world we live in now. I suppose you can attribute a lot of EA's actions to them seeing what they can get away with in pursuit of massive profits. For every good game that they've put their name to, there's at least 2 or 3 that they've made huge blunders with and made the wrong sorts of headlines, and after a while it stops being a coincidence and starts to resemble more of a pattern. I'm not saying that EA are the only developers out there that are actively disrupting the industry around them and all their customers, but I think they might just be one of the chief culprits for most of the increasingly widespread issues. Might seem like I'm beating a dead horse here, and trust me, I am, but this is a topic that will remain relevant until EA changes their ways. It's a pretty goddamn future-proof then. Given how EA operates with zero consideration for their actions, it's not completely crazy to think that some of their mistakes have come from ignorance rather than malicious intent. It's like hearing that politicians accidentally lie, or that JK Rowling says stupid shit on Twitter by mistake. And given EA's track record, it's actually kind of unbelievable to think that they didn't intentionally throw Titanfall 2 under the bus. Let me explain. 2014 saw the release of Titanfall, this interesting first-person shooter, created by former Infinity Ward founders and employees as some kind of Call of Duty meets Gundam, which immediately set it apart from the usual mire of grey and brown shooters because giant robots are always likely to have that effect. It was somewhat successful because while the concept was refreshing and fun to play around with, the game itself never really got the most out of all these ideas, with critics highlighting a short single-player campaign and a lack of multiplayer features. So good, but could be great if you lot fancy making a sequel at some point. Just don't fuck up the release window and you'll be fine.
At this point, it might be easy to forget that EA already kinda has a first-person shooter franchise, but Battlefield is different enough from Titanfall that there's no great conflict between the two. Just make sure to space their releases nice and wide apart so they don't trip over each other, and potentially leave the door wide open for Call of Duty to take maximum advantage of. And actually, Battlefield 1 did pretty alright for itself. The same can't be said about Titanfall 2.
As far as justifying decisions go, you'd have a hard time working out why EA squeezed Titanfall 2 between the Battlefield and Call of Duty games of that year. Titanfall 2, which I will now refer to as TF2 just to confuse everyone, had its fans and brought in a fair chunk of money, but it's like New Zealand going to war with China and Russia. I'm sure you can overrun them with all your sheep. It's doubly galling since Titanfall 2 fixed a lot of the first game's shortcomings and had loads to do in the multiplayer, and still has one of the best single-player campaigns from any shooter I've ever played, and TF2 deserved a lot better than being released in the week between Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. Supposedly, it was Respawn's decision to release the game at such a weird time, but EA have final say, and a lot of experience of not screwing up when to make a game available to the general public. But I suppose it all worked out in the end for EA, since they soon put Respawn to work on Apex Legends and Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order after this, at the cost of laying the Titanfall franchise to rest for the time being. But I guess it went out on a high note, but it could have been so much higher. You gotta know your competition. There is a price to bringing older games into the modern day. Well, you know, besides the inevitable realization that nostalgia has likely overinflated how you feel about games from your childhood, and how reviving an older franchise might not give the same feelings as when you were initially exposed to those games. That's always fun to think about. The price to pay is more about how the framework of games have changed over the years, and how the evolution of DLC and microtransactions have led classic-looking video games down a far more sobering path than you'd think. And it can be really off-putting sometimes, if the new Crash Bandicoot game will probably have microtransactions, and suddenly everyone was like, nah, not for me, thanks. Anticipating these caveats can severely hamper any hype that a game might be coming out, and when 2013 SimCity was intended to be a major reboot of a franchise that hadn't seen significant support for about a decade, you just knew that EA would use it as a great chance to upheave a lot of what people enjoyed about older SimCity games. Like the constant need to be connected to the internet. Ah, just like Grandmama used to make. SimCity 2013 is a fucking shambles, and it baffles me that this game was allowed to exist in the state that it was released in. At what point during development did functional human beings who dress themselves unaided in the morning decide that this mostly single-player game needed to be connected to the internet the whole time? I repeat, because I'm still not over it, SimCity 2013 was released with and still has always-on DRM for a game that most people play on their own. But EA hadn't accounted for the number of people who'd want to play this game on launch, and so the shaky servers that players had to connect to in order to play SimCity crumbled under the weight, rendering it unplayable at launch. The constant need to be connected to the internet is an insane idea that was always likely to backfire, but even the game behind it wasn't short of glitches and shoddy game design. Traffic takes the shortest route possible instead of the route with the most available options, and there was a chance that loading the game up would trigger a warning that said that if you're enjoying this video and want to see more, then make sure to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications of every new upload. EA would spend a few years licking their wounds and offering free games to players who were rightly angry that SimCity was a crock of shit, but the ultimate embarrassment would come just 2 years after its initial release. Cities Skylines is everything that SimCity tried to be and so much more, and it's honestly like the Stardew Valley to SimCity's Harvest Moon. Sad to see SimCity end like this, but I'm happy with the alternative. It's the best outcome for everyone. True horror games are a dying breed. Not so much with certain franchises and among the many indie games that are keeping these tropes alive with their unique styles of making horror games, but over the past 10 years or so we've seen a steady drift away from conventional vulnerable horror towards something a lot louder and a lot more action focused. I would say that Dead Space is slightly more inclined towards the horror action side of things, but the first 2 games showed that they were very capable of creating deeply unnerving atmospheres that could then be used for contrast when terrifying aliens come crashing through the ceiling without warning. It's a different style of horror to the fixed camera traditions of Resident Evil and Alone in the Dark, but you still feel very vulnerable while walking these halls, and that's a very good sign indeed. EA getting more involved though, that's never a good sign.
Dead Space is a franchise that gradually got worse as it went along, but unlike most games that regurgitate the same couple of ideas every few years to diminishing returns, Dead Space progressively got more action-orientated as it went along, and before you know it, you're at the 3rd game and it barely feels like anything horror at all. You know, you're still shooting aliens, but it just isn't the same.
Dead Space's ruination technically comes in 3 different parts, and you can tell that I've been thinking about it for a while if I'm able to narrow it down to 3 separate factors. I'm not so sure why Dead Space gradually lost its focus on horror and creating a disturbing atmosphere other than money, but the 3rd game is unrecognizable and is so far removed from horror at this point that it might as well be from a different series altogether. Plus, EA decided that Dead Space 3 was the perfect time to introduce microtransactions on upgrades in a single-player game. A decision that I'm still sore about, since it feels like, in more ways than one, EA have meddled with Visceral's vision for the 3rd game, and it left it feeling incredibly superfluous within its own franchise. Like, why would you ever play it when Dead Space 1 is incredible and the 2nd one is at least pretty good? Dead Space 3 sold well, but by this time EA had very high expectations for its sales figures, and when they fell short, they moved Visceral onto the ill-fated Battlefield hardline. When that didn't go very well, Visceral was closed and Dead Space was left in limbo until present day, and all I'm thinking is that all of this could have been avoided if EA had sat on their hands and let Visceral get on with their work. It's no coincidence that the best game in the series is also the one that EA were least involved with. Doesn't take a genius to work that one out.
What were you doing when you realised that EA have absolutely no idea what they're doing? We all have our loyalties to a particular franchise or brand that gets challenged when EA decide to make a game for it that flies completely against what the franchise stands for. It's just a question of which game hits you the hardest, and if governments around the world get involved as well.
Just think how the last decade would have gone if Disney and EA hadn't sunk their razor-sharp claws into Star Wars. In this exciting parallel universe, I might actually be excited to see something new being done with the Star Wars name, rather than movies that tread the same rough ground as before, and games that attempt to capture the magic of some top-quality multiplayer shooters, but coat everything in a thin but very sticky layer of bullshit. Star Wars Battlefront, in its original form, was one of the best bits of Star Wars media outside of the films, and is honestly really impressive for the time it came out in. Naturally, it got a sequel, which improved basically everything and was the source of hundreds of hours of thrilling multiplayer that went a long way towards some incredibly gratifying wish fulfillment. EA purchasing the rights to create Star Wars games meant that 2015 brought along a new Battlefront game, but now it's under the wing of the same guys who make Battlefield and frequently misuse the Frostbite engine, and have a history of bad decisions and rushed developments. What could possibly go wrong? A fair amount, but EA, the teasers, were keeping their powder dry for the sequel. Star Wars Battlefront under the EA name came in for quite a bit of criticism for having bare bones gameplay in order to appeal to as many new players as possible, while also releasing with barely any content to it so that EA can sell you some maps for silly money. Somehow, there was buzz surrounding Battlefront 2, with EA promising that they'd make a story mode this time, and that there wouldn't be a season pass, and yet looking back at these claims, I'd trade both of them in for Battlefront 2 to not have loot boxes with prizes in them that improve your in-game stats instead of being merely cosmetic upgrades. It's incredibly manipulative to hide unlocks behind hours of grinding that can be easily bypassed if you're willing to open up your wallet and give EA more money on top of the $60 you put down for the privilege of playing half a video game. Things were so bad that governments got involved, and the entire dynamic surrounding loot boxes shifted to being widely accepted as a poopy bad thing that no self-respecting video game would ever include. Nowadays, EA have found their feet a bit, and there's been at least a small period of time where everything was working correctly, and Battlefront 2 was fun to play, but this game's reputation extends far beyond the boundaries of anything that EA has ever made. My money is on this being the last Battlefront game for the foreseeable future, but I'm sure EA would love to still get in on that. They've bounced back from worse as much as I wish they wouldn't. Just stay down this time. Back when I used to go to Gamescom in Germany every year, before the dark virusy days, I kept getting invited to EA's special showcase where they'd have a ton of free demos for their upcoming releases. They also had free drinks and a tasty pasta bar, but I think it's for comfy chairs that I'm going to miss the most, because after this video, somehow I don't think they're going to invite me back anytime soon. I did think that this video is a little harsh in places, but a lot of what I've said needs saying, and nothing needs addressing more than the state of the Dungeon Keeper mobile game. It's been many moons since the first two Dungeon Keeper games, so I'll forgive you for not remembering how uniquely entertaining they were, as you built up an evil lair to keep you and your treasures safe from plucky heroes. The third game has been a long time coming, but we're not going to get it now because EA shut down Bullfrog Productions and put Mythic Entertainment to task on what was being described by them as a twisted take on Dungeon Keeper. I mean, that's one way of describing some of the worst microtransactions I've seen in any video game. They'll be calling loot boxes surprise mechanics next. How could I end this video by talking about anything else? I've seen some shit in my day, but I've never seen a game utterly annihilated as bad as Dungeon Keeper, since for the most part it follows the same rough template as the older games, just with lots more money involved. It was never going to work though, because using the Dungeon Keeper name again means that it had to stick fairly close to the features from those games. But monetization can only really be applied to things that didn't require you to wait around a few hours to get something built in the older games, or required you to put forward real money to get it built right now. Plus, this game is now more of a tower defense game, which means it's just like any other low-budget mobile game that forgoes intelligent or fun design for forcing inconvenience down the player's throat and frustrating them enough to spend an ungodly amount of money on playing the game properly. If EA wanted to do this, then fine, but inflicting Dungeon Keeper with this disease is cruel to anyone who has memories of the older games and still pines for a modern revival. Needless to say that is further away than ever before now. EA's head of mobile games, Frank Gibbo, said that Dungeon Keeper Mobile innovated too much. No one at EA knows what that word means.
This RabbidLuigi in Dungeon Keeper is a tragic case that only becomes worse when you remember all of the people who are excited for this game, since it had been 15 years since the last one, and this terrible mobile game goes nowhere towards scratching that itch. Imagine a franchise that you want to see revived getting that chance, but it being a mobile game and being full of obstructive microtransactions. How long do you reckon it would take before some kind of Stockholm Syndrome kicks in? You know, at least it's something.
So, what topic would you like to see me cover next? Leave your suggestion in a comment on this video, because I'll be taking the best ideas and making a poll on my community tab, which you can then vote on to decide what the next video is about. I'll be announcing the winner of the poll over on my Twitter, so make sure you follow me so you don't miss out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.